Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this presentation on demystifying data science tech in a regulated... Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this presentation on demystifying data science tech in a regulated world. My name is Caroline Phares. I am the Global Head of Healthcare and Life Sciences at Domino Data Lab. And with me today, I have Keith Parent, the CEO of Court Square Group, Saurin Mehta, Senior Director at GSK, and José Lacal, CTO of NIHPO. And I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to start with you, Jose. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do? What is NIHPO? Mm-hmm. What is your vision there? And then Saurin and Keith, if you could follow.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep. First of all, thank you all for coming. My name is José Lacal, and I own a small software development company. And what we're building a platform that simulates reality. You may have heard a lot about digital twins. So what we do is we create digital people, we put them into digital clinical trials, and we give them an entire synthetic medical history. And the goal of this is to accelerate the study and the evaluation of your processes by using synthetic data years ahead of the real data coming in from the trials. So in a sense, we create a synthetic parallel reality to your clinical trials. That's what we do.
And I guess what we are seeing is the avatar of you right now?
Yes.
Okay. Saurin Mehta, I work at GSK in technology as a senior director, basically servicing the needs of drug development or the focus on drug development side of the business.
Keith Parent, I am the CEO at Court Square Group. We are a managed service firm. We manage infrastructure for life science companies, pharmaceutical, biotech, med device, all the way from preclinical all the way through manufacturing.
Thanks, everyone. So we live in a very regulated world. When we're talking about life sciences, we're talking about data and insights that, conclusions that impact people's lives. So we need to be very careful with that. And we've undergone some great progress, especially since COVID, over the past few years, and even prior to that with the dawn of AI and the importance of data science in every aspect of everyone's lives at this point. We've seen, actually last week, there was a CEO of ChatGPT who testified in front of US Congress on AI, and even he was calling for regulation around AI, how AI is created. And that led me to think about whenever there is a significant amount of progress in whether it's science or technology or whatever, there is this, yes, it can be used for good, but it can also be very destructive. And this morning we heard from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an astrophysicist. And when you think about nuclear physics, that was something that was somewhat inevitable, and it's good for humanity to be able to understand that science in that way, but it can also be very destructive, as we've seen. So I think what we're talking about here on this panel is how can technology enable innovation, but also protect from danger and de-risk AI being used for wrong or data being used for destructive purposes or mistakes that can be made. So, Jose, what is your initial view on that? How you are dealing with data about people, like actually real data, and then you're creating synthetic data and helping to create synthetic trials. That data is about real people. So what's the impact there?
I will use the analogy of a domino game. I assume all of you are familiar with domino. When you look at most businesses are in the data business. Even though you ship food or Chipotle, they are really in the data business. They need to know how many people are going to come in to order a specific type of food. So in this case, the opportunity I see here to use synthetic data is that you can test all of your domino game plays by using synthetic data, just like you can test all of your AI models using data that is not real. And with that, you can validate all of the different strategies, all of the different end games. So think of an AI model is nothing more than a domino strategy for a specific game. So a way to de-risk your models, for example, is to run them with not real data that will allow you to test all the corner cases. And that also protects the privacy of your patients and the privacy of all of the tests, the actual data itself. So think of simulating life in a protected environment. That's how you can look at the domino game as a way to learn how to play without having anything at stake.
I'll probably want to add to that, at least in the technology sense, right? We are in a regulated industry, and I think it is data privacy, it is the sensitivity of the data, it is the biases. We heard quite a bit of the different biases this morning as well. I think that is the reality of things, and at least from a technology is to look and see what kind of guardrails can you put in, what kind of governance can you put in, but also be mindful that you don't want to restrict the innovation that is happening at the same time. So trying to find the balance, and I think this will be a continuing discussion in terms of how do you build models, what is the data the models were built on, how do you remove these biases in it, and again, we have the data scientists that are working on the data side of things, but from a technology perspective, how can you help them enable ensuring these biases don't exist or reduce some of these biases? But again, like I said, being mindful of ensuring that the sensitivity, the innovation that they want to drive is also accounted for. So I wouldn't say it's been addressed in any sense, but certainly something that has been coming up quite furiously for us to look at, not just providing the technology platform and say, oh, here is the pipes and just go build it, but also be mindful of making sure that the data is used for the right purposes as well. So my takeaway is there's a lot more to come in this direction, and we have to work very closely understanding from an IT perspective, understanding the data, the domains of the data, how is the data being used, well, generated as well as used to help our data scientists to be more productive. So I don't have an answer to that as much as to say there's a lot more work that we still need to do working closely with our partners there.
So basically, we cannot, the role of IT is, or tech, we'll call it tech, is not to hinder innovation, but not to put the burden of the overhead required to make sure all these controls are in place, not to put that burden on the data scientists who are really in charge of, or the purpose is innovation and deriving insights and also being able to accelerate, et cetera, and create models. So I know that we were talking about data. We were talking about human biological data, which is very sensitive data. There is a concept now that's a pretty hot concept called trusted research environments. Keith, what can you tell us about trusted research environments?
I just heard, so it was funny because getting prepared for this panel, it was one of the questions that Caroline had asked us to look into and do work, and she had sent us a video of a thing from the UK that talked about trusted research environments. And I feel like we've been doing it for so many years that to me it was second nature. But the reality is it looks at 5 key areas. They call them safe. Safe people, so people have to be trained. They have to understand what they're working on and how they're going to maintain the compliance aspects of what they're dealing with. The second is projects. They have to be ethical and they have to be approved. A lot of times it's got to be approved somehow, whether, and those of you that are used to dealing with IRBs understand how those have to go, are one thing. The next one is settings. So you have to make sure that the data itself stays where you need it to be and it doesn't leave that and go somewhere else, because you've got to show control over that and you've got to be able to do that. The fourth one is data, so it's got to be safe data, meaning that you've got to have de-identified data so that when you're dealing with the data itself, you're not exposing patient data or letting people be able to see what's there. And then the next is output, so that when you generate your output from all this data that comes in, you don't want to be able to reverse engineer and be able to identify patient populations from the data you've just given them. So those are the key tenets from a safe perspective with trusted research environments. We've been dealing with that for a very long time. A lot of the hard parts are people that want to experiment, but the reality is you still have to think day in and day out about those capabilities and understand that you're not supposed to violate most of those.
So we know it's important then for keeping data safe, for keeping patients safe, and or having trusted research environments in order to develop insights and models. What does IT or what does tech need to do? What is the role of tech in providing the capability to innovate to data scientists? Let me
jump on that, because I think part of the problem is we have IT departments within large pharma, within small biotechs. It all depends on where you are in the industry, which type of company you're dealing with. But at large pharma, you usually have an IT department. You've got a different data management group. You've got different quality groups, and they all have their goal and their goals that they have to push. One of the issues is how do we work together across those to enable the people that are actually going to be doing the science to do their job. You know, it's working with quality hand in hand so that they're not stifling what you're trying to do. IT is so used to trying to be firefighters and trying to solve the problem and getting things going. But you have to understand what is the process. It's really about people. It's really about how they go about their job and what they do and training them. People hate change. We talked about change management in the last session that was here. And you have to teach them how to use the environments they have, but follow a process. And as long as they're doing that, and you can talk about that. Somebody actually mentioned in the last session that you just say what you're going to do and just follow what you say you're going to do. And that's really kind of what you're trying to do it. As a large organization or even a small organization, I can tell you point blank that some of the biotechs that I work with run so much faster than some of the big pharma because they haven't been pushed by all those years of, those 20 plus years of things. I'll tell you, the cell and gene therapy world is even worse right now because those guys are just coming out of the lab. They don't even know how to run a business. So when you start to look and see what happens there, it's really crazy. But you have to bring down some of that. You have to bring some of the lessons we've learned to those different organizations and talk about how can you promote them to do the jobs that they need to do with that data, but at the same time stay safe with it. So it's an educational process. And IT is part of that educational process even along the way, because we're always going to change even the tools that we're using. Domino's a great talk about that. They're constantly adding new functions into what they're doing, and it's that change that's going to help spur on the future of what we're going to do with data science.
Yeah, I am part of one of those large IT organizations, and I see what you're saying, but I think the direction that we are heading, and a lot of the companies are heading, is that we are now looking in a partnership with business, right? So it's no longer about it's IT, it's business, or whatever organization we are working with internally. We are looking to build what we call a data fabric or a data mesh or a data platform. And the whole idea, to your point, is how do we enable the data scientists to bring all these different sets of data in a way that is very consumable, right? The data is trusted, the data is well governed, the ontologies are there, we're getting a little bit deeper into it. But I use the analogy that wouldn't it be great that somebody just comes, like your home, turn on the red faucet, get the hot water, turn on the blue faucet, get cold water, having data being available in that mindset, right? This is the kind of data I need, I just go and get my data. I don't need to figure out where it's coming from, how it's coming from. Now, IT working with our data partners can enable that, right? And today, that is the direction a lot of us are going, so that we can really enable, to your point, of not being siloed in any way, but being partners with our business to make that happen. Mm-hmm. At least that's one avenue I see progressing on. So
do you think that within an IT department, you actually do need domain expertise in some way? Because I see different levels. We have the provisioning of infrastructure and the provisioning of data, and you mentioned the not having to think about where I need to get the data, but have it be available to me when I need it. There's that. There's this other level of we have multimodal data. We have data in various formats from different places. How do you pull that together? Do you think that that's IT's job to pull it together and to surface it, or do you think there's this level of data engineering that is on the business side and domain side, which actually to scientists, if you go to the science level, data scientists are almost like a tech group to the scientists. So where does IT fit? And
my take, again, I think we are evolving quite fast in the sense that, when I started at GSK about a year ago, and the first thing when I met my business partner, I said, I don't fix laptops. And I think, there's this classic understanding, if there's a tech problem, we're gonna call IT. I think the expertise that we bring, so yes, there are different layers of technology, infrastructure, and of course now cloud computing. We provide as partners. So I don't see myself and say, I'm an expert in this area of technology and I bring that to the table, but in my capacity, have a good understanding of the business, good understanding of the data, so that we can not alleviate, but elevate all of us to the next level, right? So I think it's more of a partnership that I see in the different stacks of the technology, that yes, there are people that provide tech services, hard technology, data engineering probably as well, but also providing more as a business partner to showcase what is feasible from a technology perspective without really having to understand the technology itself. So I see us growing, and business as well. They're getting very savvy. When I joined and they start talking of some of the terminology of the tech, they're also very comfortable without having to understand exactly how it works. It's like ChatGPT. I don't need to understand. It's a big, large models, complex models, but I don't need to understand it. I think so we hide some of that complexity, but also be able to enable working closely with the business, knowing their domain, I would say.
And one point that I would like to make is that the way I see it is there is this tech stack that Saurin rightfully addressed. And in parallel, there is another stack that I call the data stack. And if you think again in terms of dominoes, at the bottom you have the laws and regulations, FDA, EMA, and those are constantly changing. On top of that, you have internal processes, and big companies have lots of processes. On top of that, you have the metadata management, control terminologies, ontologies. Then you have the study data. And on top of that, you have the PII, the personally identifiable information. One of the challenges in this highly regulated industry is that those layers are constantly moving. So not only do you have the technical stack challenges, you also have how do you manage all of these moving pieces that you need to comply with. You need to comply with the laws, you need to comply with privacy, you need to comply with metadata management. And that is where you need to have tools and processes to handle not just the technical side, but also the compliance and the data side.
I think one of the things, Caroline, that when you look at people, particularly IT people, you're hiring people for a technical skill. And they come in and they come into a large pharma, they come into a biotech, and they know their technology piece of it. They don't necessarily want to grasp the pieces that we need from a compliance perspective. One of the issues that we deal with on a very regular basis is working with them to kind of show them how it can be ingrained in what they're doing day in and day out, because they really want to just solve that problem. They're trying to use their technology, or they're trying to take on that new piece of technology and figure out how to do it. By showing them some very simple techniques of building gold images or doing IQs that we set up and doing those kind of things, we're teaching them a different way to do it. And there's actually a consistency that they get from that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, that in other industries, they may not have to worry about that. Finance is just as regulated from a perspective of what they do, but they have different ways of doing it. And I think part of our issue is when we look at regulatory environments, particularly when you get into clinical and regulatory, some of these guys have worked on systems prior to that. They might work on LIMS systems or lab notebooks or different things. And They may not have been as regulated or worried about the compliance as much, but then they start getting into the clinical data coming in or the regulatory data because we're going to do submission work. And we're under tight time frames. You know, every day costs money that we're doing that stuff. So you can't do changes in your blackout period during that submission. So it's teaching them some of the reasons why we do some of that as well, which is part of what we do from a perspective of all the IT folks that we deal with, whether it's in a company, because sometimes what we'll do is we'll take on the compliance aspects of those qualified and validated environments in the IT department at some of the companies that we work with. We'll deal with the non-qualified stuff. So they're dealing with all the mail systems or the other systems that are there, and then we'll take and integrate data from other places as we're doing that. So there's just a learning curve that we have to keep constantly building into our corporate culture as well from an IT perspective.
I hope it's okay if I add to it, even though I'm a moderator. And just so everybody knows, I have been with Domino for a little bit over a year, but prior to that, I was a customer of Domino. So there's certain things about the Domino platform and what Domino has done since I have joined is focus a lot on how to enable the innovation, how to make being compliant with regulations and being controlled something that users don't have to think about because it's there underlying everything. It's a foundation of control and orchestration. It's that foundation of reproducibility and traceability, which is very, very important in the pharmaceutical industry. You don't have to think about it. So whether you're doing GXP work or non-GXP work, you talked about, you know, some of the stuff that happens in the research, more exploratory stuff that happens in the research part of R&D is not as regulated as what you're doing in clinical trials and in the development part. If you can do that in one platform and be able to access the same data easily, yet within with security in place, you've solved a problem that has been in the pharmaceutical industry for a very, very long period of time, where there were silos created by technology because you wouldn't be able to have the flexibility of using whatever tool you wanted and combine that with the data, clinical data, and perhaps other data. Now we have that. So I think that as people in IT, that's what we can offer the user community, the data science community, the scientific community, the medical writers, the ability to go in and look and see what the statisticians have produced as far as clinical study reports and that kind of thing. So
I think the other part, Caroline, is in the industry, we're so used to wanting to get the next shiny penny and try to do the new thing. Mm-hmm. Well, part of the issue is there's lots of good companies out there creating really great tools in other industries. And I think even Domino, to that effect, you've done a lot of stuff in other industries. The issue is how do we just take some of the techniques that we have within the regulated space and put them around what we're working on so that we can make them compliant. Yeah. And as long as we do that and we document it, part of the issue is techies hate documentation, right? So that's part of the issue. As long as we document it, we put those things in place, all of a sudden we can take this tool and let Domino keep adding new functionality, let them keep adding stuff. We'll put the IQs around it, we'll put the stuff around it that we need to, and then be able to let the researchers do their work. Mm-hmm. Let them use a tool that we've now kind of blessed and said, hey, as long as quality's happy with it and they're looking at how we set it all up, we're good to go. So I think that's the kind of thing that we have to work hand in hand with quality and with the scientists.
I think to Saurin's earlier point, the IT teams can bring a lot of value to the company by stepping away from the traditional, my Outlook is not working, and taking more the approach of every data analyst coming into the office, coming to a table, and at that table, their desk, all the data is available, and they can just plug and play and create new models, create new tools. There's a huge opportunity for IT to become that data gatherer. So the data analyst doesn't need to go find who has the latest Excel going back to 20 years later. We're still using Excel in many pharma companies. And data, the IT team can say, here is the table, sit at the table, we have this data factory underneath that's going to find, surface, and organize the data for you, and you can focus on playing your game, whatever that game is, the game of data.
I think the only thing I would probably want to add to what you said, Caroline, in terms of the description, and maybe you meant it, was the word trust. So to all of this, I think the trust is the big factor. So can I trust the data I'm accessing? Can I trust who has made what changes to it and know what changes have been made? So I think that's where we really need to be engaged and make sure that the users and the consumers of the data can trust the data. So.
And then when you're talking about AI and you're talking about models, similarly, I think it can't be necessarily a black box, because if you have to tell the story of why a decision was made at some point, you need to be able to go back and understand how the model was created, right? And what data was it trained on? And to be able to tell that story, I think IT has a large role in making that possible.
Yeah.
So.
Except the AI models are getting so fancy that you don't know exactly how, or you can't trace it back exactly how they came up with a conclusion or the output as needed. And I think there's a lot of work going on in that direction as well. So yes, we provide the platform, the traceability, where the data came from, but the models itself are getting so more complicated or complex that's also an area that we need to figure out, that how can we show the true traceability of how that output was generated. So, but that's a complete new area that we are embarking on now. So. Mm-hmm.
And I think actually going back to, I think Nick Alperin actually said it this morning at his when he was speaking. I don't know if you were there. It was about the citizen data scientists and versus Domino itself as a platform where you write code to create models, to develop models. And I think it's important to know how that model was created, as far as go back and look at the code to understand what it was doing or what the algorithm was. So
yeah, I think Domino in that capacity, there's so much more potential that we will continue to tap into. And just listening in today with more capabilities that are coming in, I think it provides that a level of trust factor from an IT perspective when we're looking to roll this out to a broader organization. So, yeah.
Let's talk about a little bit about data. There's regulations and country regulations. If you even think about the EU, think about GDPR. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the data can't leave the country where it was collected. I also think it's important that's another area where IT can help. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I knew we work on worldwide studies all the time. We work on registries, different things like that. You have to understand the concept of geofencing. You have to understand the fact that the tools that you're using have to be able to look at different data sources in different areas and be able to combine them and use them. Again, it gets back to that trusted research environment where the data can't leave where it starts. So depending on the type of data, you can still use that data to gather information and insights, but the data has to stay where it is, and you've got to understand that can't change, right?
That's a real challenge. That really is a challenge right now. And I think, just if I can pick on Domino, I think with your product Nexus, I believe that mm-hmm. is, right? We're really looking forward to see how that can enable us in ways that we don't have to create point solutions for every country, for every regulation or whatever. But that is a real challenge that has multiplied, I would say, in the last few years, that from an IT perspective, it's quite difficult to manage that, right? And then we are looking for solutions that we can provide as a standard service across all our technologies or all our systems that we have. So for example, if I have 20 systems running, I can't replicate 20 systems in every country, for example, right? So I think they are real challenges, and I think products like Nexus, I'm hoping, will help us address some of these, because that's not going away.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other side, just like we talked about the citizen scientists, and we can all become or be citizen scientists, I think there is The other side of the coin is we're all citizen regulators, meaning we're all, those of us who are entrusted with data, we have the moral obligation to handle that data properly, comply with the laws and the regulations. So it's not just up to the company to protect the data. All of us who have access to data need to also manage and secure that data.
But I will say, Jose, that up until maybe 6 months ago, I deal with a lot of large companies, small companies across the board. I'm on a bunch of industry groups, and I hadn't even heard the word digital twin. And all of a sudden, within the last 6 months or so, we're talking a lot more about digital twins and things like that. So it was interesting for you when we first talked about this panel and the stuff that you guys do, the concept of doing more and more of those kind of things. And I think computing is getting to a point now where it's getting easier to do some of that. Because before, just trying to even get close to that would have sucked up all the computing power you had. But as we get closer to being able to use more of those tools, I think we'll think in more ways about using some of those same concepts. So I think you guys are onto something.
Yeah. Thank you. The analogy that I use is a racetrack, and I always compare a clinical trial with a racetrack, meaning the regulators tell you need to have 2 turns and it's 120 degrees, whatever you go up, down. For those of you into Formula One, there is a very defined track. The opportunity I see for synthetic data, digital twins, is you can run your race hundreds or thousands of times. You can crash every now and then, and you just restart, change some parameters, modify the spoilers, the ailerons, the tires, and run again. That's the opportunity I see for synthetic data across all processes. Run as many times as you want without private data, obviously, going back to your moral obligation to respect private data. But if it's fake people running on fake clinical trials, literally let it rip and have fun.
Yeah.
So I think we have a few minutes for questions. Are any questions from the audience at all?
I have a question.
Sure.
This is for the synthetic data. Actually, I was kind of interested. So what are the chances when you generate synthetic data that it will actually be an actual person? If you generate enough data, sooner or later, it would become something real. So what are the chances that synthetic data would be not me, but it would actually be a person if you just dig and look hard enough? So.
Yeah, that's a good question. There is non-trivial, meaning it's higher than 0. There's a high probability that eventually, if we crank up enough billions of synthetic people, we will create somebody who looks like Peter and has a sense of fashion like Peter and has the same personal interest as Peter. That is definitely a possibility. For those of you into sci-fi, Isaac Asimov has a fantastic series. It's called the Foundation series, where he talks about in the future where science advanced so much that they create a new science called psychohistory, where they are able to predict history because they have there's such a huge number of people that it becomes predictable what history is going to become. And that's similar to that concept. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. But.
No, that's good. Sorry. Okay, sorry.
So we have lots of data, as you all know, in our industry, right? And we always are looking for opportunities to maximize the value of the data we already have. So there are a lot of initiatives around the industry to reuse data as much as possible. So I'm just wondering what are your perspectives on how data science tech can enable that?
Well, she is at GSK, so I'm not sure if I want to answer that question right now. Sorry, Eileen, we'll take it offline, but more for you guys.
I can tell you, I'm working with a company right now that has this really advanced search engine that they do a great job at indexing when they index across lots of different formats of data and things like that. They allow you to keep the data within their existing repositories. So then you can do searches across those repositories and start to surface data out of multiple systems. So there's lots of times with these big companies, you've got 20, 30 years worth of legacy data. Nobody wants to move that legacy data. Nobody wants to be able to pull that stuff out. But if I can use AI and I can use inferences between data within different systems and I can pull that together, all of a sudden you get insights out of that. Now, maybe you don't want to build everything on that, but if you can start to see patterns in your own data, maybe then you can push you on the projects you're going to do to try to pull data out of different systems, maybe for your data lake or other things that you're going to do, but you need a starting point. And I see that's where AI can really help out. If AI can look at, how do I look across different ways that in multiple data ontologies and how we set up data in the past and how these systems are set up, those kind of ways AI can actually help us to be able to find things or do different things.
A different approach is we have built a metadata repository, so we manage different releases of SNOMED and LOINC and all of those terminologies. And one of the projects that I want somebody to fund me to do is to go into a pharma company, look at the last 30, 40 years, get all of their old control terminologies going back 30, 40 years, so we can recode the old data with today's control terminologies and then feed that to AI. So kind of like harmonize all data to a specific standard and then use that as the ground truth for creating new models. So there's a lot of data, but sometimes it's not accessible data. It's not usable data.
Maybe if I can just add, and not specifically to what Eileen was asking, but I think one of the challenges we have in our companies is that, one, data is all over the place. We don't know what data is there, so certainly through AI and profiling, we can get more insights. But we also find the situation where the group that generated data doesn't want to share the data, right? So even within companies, we have a hard time getting data. So we really have to drive around data as an asset. How do you drive that as an asset? How do you build these platforms, make the data available? And of course, what we spoke about, making it trustworthy and high quality data. But we even find these simple challenges of just being able to access the data. And I think those are the hurdles that technology is there today to do a lot of the stuff that you just called out. But there are these small challenge, not small, but these are these challenges of getting the access to the data, being able to profile the data, being able to make it trustworthy, that we have to surpass.
But that's kind of almost like corporate change management at that point,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
It's kind of a way of modifying your thinking on your own data.
200%, 100%, yeah.
So this is great, by the way, thank you. One of the foundational concepts that we have is consent for use of data, because people own their own data and we act as stewards of it in these biomedical organizations. In my opinion, we're pretty bad at that. Do you see any ways that we could improve our ability to people, for example, to revoke consent for future use of their data? Or for organizations to have a different idea for their intended use and reach back and ask for an updated consent?
There's one thing that I have seen, and it's conceptual. I'm not sure if anybody has done this yet, but there's this idea of storing clinical data in a knowledge graph and being able to have one node, which might be the subject ID, the person who has consented to the use of their data. If you wanted to remove consent, if they wanted to revoke their consent, you just delete that node and everything else about them is pretty much, it gets deleted. You won't be able to include them. But I actually wonder, what is the impact of that? Because what if you've created results that include them, and then maybe this is my own ignorance in this sense, I don't know everything. If somebody revokes consent and their data is actually included in results that have already been delivered, or results or data sets that have already been produced, it's nearly impossible to be able to go there and remove that person's data from all of those results and conclusions. So, I think it's a huge challenge. I don't necessarily see.
In the EU, there is a very strong concept of the right to be forgotten. And I don't know to what extent and how granular it can be, but there is a precedent in law already, and the GDPR is obviously orders of magnitude stronger than whatever is in the US.
And I think that we're, in the US even, because we're global companies, at least in the pharmaceutical industry, I don't know of any company that's not global. We end up complying, or pharmaceutical companies end up complying with all of those regulations, whether it's like 21 CFR Part 11, or U.S. regulations, or whether it's EU regulations, we tend to do that. But
I think to the question of consent, though, I know I've dealt with a number of companies who are looking at future consent use and future consent language, that they're trying to get their consent so that the patient will realize that it can be used for this study or future use. And then also, some of the things I've been doing with some larger CROs is they're looking at, in their consent language, they're actually adding consent saying, we can use this to help develop tools that make our job easier to do things. Like, you want to be able to use multiple clinical trial data sets to be able to go in and auto-classify. We're doing some projects of auto-classifying TMF. So there's no reason I can't take past trials to be able to do that kind of work. So if you put the right consent language in, you can use it for certain purposes, because they're not necessarily going to affect patient health in general. You're looking at classifications or tools that help us as an industry do a better job and cut that time down. So those are things, some of the areas that they're working in consent languages.
Regarding data that's out there, one tool that social media companies use is hashing, right? So there may be a solution there regarding that question. But regarding my question, as a startup founder, one of the many hats I wear is trying to follow FDA regulation in my specific zone. Is there any trend that you find interesting or surprising, or do you have any interesting things that you might be following to share with us in terms of the rapidly evolving FDA regulation of AI products in healthcare?
That's that I think is a fantastic question. I mean, it's something, because it's so new. I mean, we know the regulations are coming. Even as of last week at the Congress, that show. We know these regulations are coming, and they need to be there. I think they need to be there. So how are we going to respond to that?
I actually see a lot more of it in the device world, particularly around in healthcare, when they're doing operations and things like that, and using AI to identify tumors and things like that. So you're seeing a lot more push around that area, and those regulations are actually going to spill over and be used as kind of a starting point for some of the other ones that we're using for figuring out patient populations and things like that. So that's what I've been noticing in the different groups that we've been working with.
Yeah, I don't have much. Just to an extension also, it's not just devices now. Software is a medical device as well, right? So I think you're right, it's evolving quite fast, but we haven't really been pushing in that direction yet. So I'm actually relying more on companies like yours to help us.
I think it's more an issue of the validation of the AI models and how we can validate those models, because what you worry about is the data that I'm using to make these models biasing the data that we're doing or the AI routines. Those are things we have to constantly worry about.
I was talking earlier about the citizen data scientists are basically, or a code. I actually think this is what I see coming. I don't know if I'm right or not, but I think being able to go back and look at the code that was used to generate the model or generate the AI is going to be more and more important. So I'm sure there's going to be a review of that. That's going to be part of the regulations. And before a model can be used in a impactful production manner, there's probably going to be independent review of not only of the code, of the data that was used to train it, and all of that kind of stuff. Very similar to what we do in clinical trials.
In the medical device space, there is already this concept of a software bill of materials, where you need to disclose all the software elements that go into your medical devices, which at the end, like Andreessen said, software is eating the world. So most medical devices are mostly software with some hardware on top. So you really need to disclose what's in your device. That will be the next step to Caroline's point.
Documentation.
Right.
And evidence.
Yeah, that's true. I think we are at time. So thank you, everyone, for joining this conversation, and thank you to our panelists.